Hello, I'm Tom Baer. I'm the president of the Upton Historical Society, and we're here at the Upton Museum on the second floor of the Ristine building, and we're going to give you a tour of the new hat industry display that was set up here over the last few months in support of the Blackstone Heritage Corridor programs around the valley. And with me this evening is Ellen Arnold. She's a staff member here at the museum.
Thank you, Tom, for the introduction, and good evening, everyone. First, before I start talking about the general industry, I'd like to introduce you to William Knowlton. And although William Knowlton had many partners in the hat industry, he was the principal mover and shaker. He had several different jobs. He was apprenticed over the years to other types of manufacturing. He went into business in the hat industry, and that was really the start around 1833 of the hat industry in Upton.
Okay, I'd like to give you a little introduction to the hat industry in Upton. It was the early 1800s, and the area was pretty much all farming, with shops and things around town to support the farming. And as part of that, the shops would sell straw braid, which merchants would buy to make bonnets and maybe other items in their homes. And where they procured the braid was that the farmers would grow rye, and once they'd harvested the grain, then they would take the straw, and the ladies of the house would split the straw into small strips and braid it. It would wet it so that it was flexible and then braid it into braid. And periodically, someone would come around from the shops and buy up their braid and take it to the shops to sell. And eventually, the shops started to do their own making bonnets and so forth for sale to the public. And then along comes Knowlton, William Knowlton, in about 1833, came here from Hopkinton, and he set up a shop on the corner of Warren Street and North Main Street, just opposite where the town hall was built later on. And that was done in this area here. And he worked for a man by the name of Stoddard, who had a store there. And he got really interested and active in procuring the straw and selling straw and making bonnets and so forth. And he was so active with it that another merchant from West Upton hired him to come to his shop in West Upton. And from that shop in West Upton, then they were doing even more work in bonnets and hats and so forth from the straw braid. Eventually, the shop was shut down, and they just went exclusively making straw hats and so forth. So that was one of the very early industries. The map that we have here, the West Upton is here, and the hat factory was eventually grew and grew and grew. One of the early buildings of the hat factory is visible in this picture, one of the very early ones. This is the shop that was across the street from the town hall, where Knowlton first got involved in the straw braid. And then as the Knowlton company expanded, their offices and their buildings in West Upton grew. And then eventually, when the hat business wound down, it was converted into the Millhouse Apartments. Some of the other hat industries in town were Benson and Nelson, which was at the corner of School Street and Main Street. It was a very large building. You wouldn't believe there was space for it there. But around 1890, they had a large building there making hats. And then eventually, that building burned down, and they moved down School Street to the corner of Stoddard Street, where another man had been trying for a couple of years to get a hat business going. But the Benson and the Nelson took that over. And this building, which is down behind the Millhouse, Knowlton factory buildings, and it still stands, that building was part of the Knowlton business, but when Knowlton and his successors sold out, this building was taken over by Gordon Benson, who had, I believe, worked in the factory, and he made hats there for a while. And then he sold the business when he retired or Frank Andrade and Rico Trotta, and they ran a hat business in there called Frank Rico Hats. Okay, this building was a carriage house for one of the Knowlton mansions, set back off of Main Street. It was still there up to about maybe 5 years ago when it burned. But in that building, in the later years, after the big factory shut down, Jenny Rand had a small hat shop in there and made hats in that factory. This is a picture of the factory at the corner of School Street and Stoddard Street. Again, a very huge building, you know, and you can imagine a lot of people working in a building like that making hats. So although Knowlton is the business that's generally known in town for the hat industry and being centered in West Upton, you can see that there was a lot of other businesses popping up around town for various times. And then eventually Knowlton, because of their size and their ambitions, began to dominate the industry.
Earlier, I mentioned Mr. Knowlton had many partners through the years, and he did also go through a couple of bad years during recessions in the 1800s when he had to borrow money. And although he had advice that he didn't have to pay back his creditors in full, he did do that. It took him time, but he did it, earning him the reputation of doing good business. And some of the companies and brands that were made here in Upton included Thornton and Brewster, and I'll mention some others as we're going along. This table represents some of the earlier things that were used in the hat making industry. This is a hat form. This is one piece. This form here is actually 3 pieces, and which enabled it to be put into the hat before it was steamed. This straw hat was one of the Knowlton Fifth Avenue labels that was inside the brim, and this was made with grosgrain ribbon trim, and I'm not quite sure the date, but it is a Knowlton hat. The blocks in our collection are made of wood, such as this, and this came apart in pieces. It would be put into the hat, and this hat would have been made on a form similar to this, although this is not the correct size, but it would be, the pieces would be put into the hat to form it, and then it would be steamed. This hat is stitched by hand. It's about 1890. Another plaster block that's one piece. This looks like it would have been some of the earlier hats. This is the very first straw hat in our collection. It's a handmade black straw bonnet. It was made about 1835, so it is one of the earliest hats made by the company. It was his first model, and it was worn by the great-great-grandmother of a former Upton resident. And these are some of the machines in the back that would have been used in the production. This is payday. The men are collecting their pay. Again, another payday in one of the shops where the hats were getting ready to be sent out. If you can see, this is a small picture, but those are hat racks that were throughout the factory, and those hats are probably waiting to be trimmed. I want to mention this sewing machine, which was one of 2 that the Society has. I'm told that this is actually not set up for sewing the straw. This would have been set up for the trims, but this can be converted with the use of a foot to actually sew straw. Another hat block here. This hat, when it was first stitched, would have been put on a block, what they call a hat block. And this happens to be made of what they call Shanzi straw. And earlier, when they used the wooden blocks in the early part of the process, they would use the racks here in the steamer room. And these are hat bodies that would have been steamed on blocks, such as we've been looking at. And then what they would do is hold these little pads would be placed on them as they were steamed to hold the shape of the hat. This block on the floor, a metal one, is called a hot block, and that was used in the finishing process. After the hot hat was completely made and trimmed, it was put on this block for the final shaping and sizing to make sure it was perfect before it went out. So I just wanted to show you a few other things that were used in the industry. Again, we have more types of straw. This is a plastic straw, and this would have been used much later, probably again during the period when Knowlton was unable to get the natural straw. This is a wool straw, or not actually straw, but a wool braid type. This turquoise children's hat was made by Lainey Carroll, one of the people who helped set up the display for her daughter around 1965 when she worked for the Giovanni hat shop. In this case, we have some beautiful sample books of braid. I wish I could show you every page, but there are a couple of good examples here of various braids from around 1892 to 1893. And that just every page is different colors and different styles of braid. This is probably one of the earlier pieces of braid in our collection, the very tiny, tiny work in that. That must have been pretty hard to sew. Again, more braid, again, not true straw, and more plastic. I'm just going to move along here to some examples of hats. This hat was made around 1928 to 1930, and it was on display in the State House several years ago. Senator Moore asked us to provide one for an exhibit as an example of industry in Upton. The salmon cloche is very nice. That was donated by Mrs. Barton. And we have here examples of some of the lace that would have been used as trim on the hats. I'm just moving over to this case to show you several examples of hats through the years. And I did show the earliest hat in our collection. This top shelf includes other very early hats. This little bonnet was about 1865. That was a sample, actually, that was used as a patent by the straw workers. And this rust-colored velvet bonnet is about 1880 to 1890. This cute little number here, again, about 1890 to 1900. It's a black straw bonnet, and it was trimmed with silk ribbon. There are black beads, artificial flowers, and it was thought to be made as an early Knowlton model. And it was owned by Annie Moore and Annie Keithley. This last hat in the top here is a straw bonnet, about 1845, so it's very close to the period of the other bonnet that I showed you. It's a very intricate loop design of plaited straw. These examples were period, perhaps not made by Knowlton, but this is a lady's Northbridge hat sold in Richard Haley of Worcester, and Moonbeam hats about 1928. I just have to show you this. It's one of my favorite pieces here at the Society. It's a little purse, and it was made with melon seeds. I have no idea who made it, but it's always intrigued me. And below here we have several examples of hats. This includes a men's top hat. So this felt derby is from Henry Dollar of New York. And I just think that's so lovely with the veil. There was a Knowlton shop in New York, so I don't know actually how many of these hats could possibly have been made in Upton, or if they were purchased elsewhere and brought to New York. However, I do know that we sold many hats to New York, and there is a story about a local Upton teacher who for many years wanted to own a hat made in Paris. So she finally made her trip to Paris, and she purchased a hat there and brought it home, and when she really looked into it under the label, she found out it had been made in Upton. So I thought that was very interesting. On the top we have a hat, a Panama Scout hat made about 1910, 1960. This is LaRose hats from New York. So I just want to show you another case where we have more recent examples of hats. This little board was put together by Lainey Carroll, one of the people that helped me assemble this display. It's examples of various types of braid that would have been used by Knowlton and others through the years. In this case, we have some more recent hats. The hats on the bottom were made by Cartagena, with the exception of the little pillbox that would have been made by Lish. And Knowlton sold to Merrimack in 1926. And eventually Merrimack sold to Cartagena. And Lish was one of the last hat industries that used the Knowlton Hat Factory. So on the second shelf, we have examples of hats from the Jenny Rand era. Jenny owned a shop in West Upton on Main Street, and Lainey actually did work for her along with many other Upton ladies that can tell you a lot more stories than I can. But I find her hats very, although contemporary, they're very stylish, and I feel would have been appropriate for many, many things. All of the trim that's in this case, the tiny little pieces, were made for the Jenny Rand shop. These may be samples instead of actual trim, so they may have used these as patents. And then on the top, we're not sure about the two outside hats who made them, but those are the period of 1950s. So when I was growing up, Mamie Eisenhower, President Eisenhower's wife, always had one of these little caps on. Before I go on to finish on some of the hat industry and the hats we have in our collection, I just wanted to point out this lovely dress, which is probably in the 1890 period. We have a fairly decent size clothing collection that people have been very generous through the years. We have examples of everything from formal dresses that would have been used for weddings, or right down to a gym uniform. So I invite you sometime to come in and take a look at what we do have on display, although we do change out the display quite frequently. This hat is circa 1908, and it's on loan from a member of the society. I found that quite lovely, and that would have been used in the wintertime. It has that velvety feel. Another example, and I'm sorry, can't tell you what year, but I find that a lovely star example. These would probably have been about 1960s. It was quite common for ladies going to church in the 1960s to wear that type of hat. This little hat would have been used in the 1960s. It was quite common for church or for even a wedding type veil for a bridesmaid. And we have another lovely hat here of a more recent era. And this hat is the most recent acquisition in our collection. It was a lady that came to see the exhibit and left us with this hat. We haven't done a whole lot of research on it yet, but it does have the Merrimack label in it, and it's probably very difficult to say, but it's something you should always check when you're looking at a hat. And does it have a Merrimack label, Brewster, Knowlton? There are many periods, as I said. There's a little bit more to the story because the Knowltons were quite influential and generous in town, and the factory actually influenced many of the buildings that we have in town today. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom right now.
I mentioned earlier about the Knowlton business starting out in Upton Center, and then Mr. Knowlton went to West Upton to work for Mr. Legg in his store, and then they developed the straw business and the hat industry in their store in West Upton, and then eventually Knowlton took over the company completely as in charge of it. So to show you the extent of what the Knowltons did in West Upton, I have this map here. Main Street's coming down through here, and Hartford Ave North, and Hartford Avenue South. So this is the center of West Upton. The large Knowlton hat factory is here. The Legg store, where the Knowltons began working with Mr. Legg, was approximately in this location beside the factory. So over the years, the factory grew. They were producing more and more hats. They needed more workers. So where did they get workers? They brought in farm girls from the surrounding countryside, and then when they couldn't get enough there, they were bringing women in from Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, New Brunswick, Quebec, and so forth. So there was a large influx of young people coming in from these northern towns where they were coming from farms where they didn't really have the opportunity to get any work. And so they could come down here to work, and eventually many of them married and they stayed here. So you'll notice around Upton that there's quite a few families with French names or French descendants. So now you've got the workers and you have to house them. So they had a dormitory beside the factory, and then it grew and they built the lodge, which is across the street from the factory, and that lodge is still there today. It's called the Upton Inn, and then they had other buildings around in this area to house the supervisors, all up and down the street here, and even up towards on the east side of Upton, West Upton Center. And now you've got the workers, and in the wintertime, when they were really busy making hats for the upcoming spring, they could have 800 to 1,000 workers in the factory. So you've got the workers, you've got the housing, and now you have to feed them. So the Knowltons established the Knowlton Farms, and that took up most of the land between Main Street and Hartford Avenue South and Glen Ave over here. So they had a huge farm to supply the food, and now they've got everything established. But they also, along the way, they had to have a water system. So they had wells in the area, and they pumped water up to a reservoir on Rockdale Hill, and that would feed the water. Eventually, they built a gas plant, and they had gas for the gas lights, probably in the Knowlton mansions, and maybe some on the street. I don't know if they used it to light the factory or not, but they did have a gas plant there. Then they had children. Children, you have to put them into school. So they built a school across the street here on the factory side of Main Street. And so they had a school for the children, but then the family mansions, which were on the north side of Main Street, they didn't like all the noise from the school children down there. So they closed that school, and they built another school over at about where the Coach Road Apartments is now, and that was called the Knowlton School. So now you've got the school. They had businessmen coming to visit them in the factory and make arrangements for purchasing and dealing in hats. So they built a hotel, and the hotel was again right here in Upton Center, near where the gas station is, about where the gas station is. They built a large hotel, businesses on the first floor, a big hall on the second floor called Knowlton Hall, where they had entertainment and dances and so forth. The Knowltons attended the Unitarian Church in downtown Upton Center. And I guess they decided that was too far to go, all the way across town to go to church. So they built a church at the corner of Main Street and Hartford Avenue South. It became the Unitarian Church, and they invited the Unitarians to move over to this church and abandon the one in Upton Center. And that was quite controversial. Some did want to move, some didn't. Eventually, the church moved to West Upton, and a number of the members of the church from different parts of the town decided that they didn't want to move and attend the church in West Upton, so they went off to join other denominations. So they've got the church. There was a post office in the hotel business, in the hotel building, and so forth. But now to conduct their business, when it comes to shipping hats and so forth, they needed crates and boxes. So over at this location, we have Lake Wildwood, comes down underneath of William Street and along West Main Street, and then underneath of Glen Ave. And right in that section there was a box mill, water-powered box mill. And there's still remnants of that mill still there today. If you can look up the stream from Glen Avenue, you can see remains of that building. So they had the boxes here. They would bring the boxes over to the factory, and now they had to ship. Once they're loaded, they have to ship them out. They worked with the Grafton Railroad, and they got that Grafton Railroad extended down to Upton, so it became the Grafton-Upton Railroad, and that came up here along south of the factory. So they had roads coming down here. Depot Street came down from the factory right to the railroad, and also at the railroad there was a station to unload coal. So they brought coal in on the railroad and shipped hats out on the railroad. Some of the housing that was set up and used for the workers, prior to the hotel being built here at the corner in West Upton, there was a very large inn. It stretched for many, many feet along the street there. It was a very large building because this was a crossroads for stage coaches on two stage routes. So it was a big inn there. Knowlton bought that to build his hotel, but they didn't want to waste the building, so they cut the building up into pieces. And there's pieces over here on Centennial Court, there's pieces on Hartford Avenue South, and I think there's a few more pieces of the building around that are still occupied as residences today. There was also a West Upton train depot for other shipping and for passengers to board the train. This is the lodge, which is now the Knowlton Inn, which housed many of the workers at the time. This is an internal picture at the lodge showing the dining room. It was very nicely laid out and nicely built. I mentioned the school. This was a District 8 school that was there not far from the factory along Main Street, and that's the one that the Knowltons decommissioned so that they would move the children to another school. That building still stands, and it's a private residence today. Adjacent to the factory, they had a dormitory, large dormitory building there, as well as the one at the lodge. Now the farms, you can see from the pictures the extent of this. This is a horse barn. It's a very, very large building and a beautifully architected. In addition to the horse barn, there's a cow barn. It's another huge building for the cows. You can notice all the ventilators on the roof there. With that many cows in there, they had to ventilate it. This is an ox cart that was used on the farm, and the building in the background is still there along Farm Street. And down in the lower meadow is where they grew a lot of the crops and the hay in particular. So this photograph shows the lower meadow down towards Hartford Avenue South, and a whole row of workers there working in the field. Although the Knowltons had a large development, and they really were the family that built West Upton into what it is today, their holdings weren't just focused in West Upton. They did have land all around town. Some of the buildings that were more closely associated with the Knowltons, this is the carriage house and the stable. It doesn't look much like that here because this is a newer picture where it was converted. At one time, it was a small hat shop, and then later it was used as a residence, but it has burned down since then. On the north side of the main street there are the two Knowlton mansions that still exist. There are some modifications because there was fire in one of them at one time. One of them was used as the Knowlton Manor nursing home, and now it's been converted to condos. And the other mansion is I believe, a private residence today. Down on the lower side, I have a picture of one of the early train cars that ran on the Grafton-Upton Railroad, and a photograph of the West Upton Depot was at the end of Depot Street, and that burned down as well, so we've lost that. And to round it out, more on the east side of the town was the Willard store, one of the general stores in that part of town. This is the Unitarian Church that the Knowltons had built. And that building still is there, and it's now the Statewood Art Gallery. Here's a picture of the school they built, the second school over there in West Upton. The Coach Road Apartments now occupies that territory. Down here is a picture of the Hotel Pleasant in Knowlton Hall. This is the building that the Knowltons built there to entertain their employees and their workers. I think the second floor is where they had a entertainment hall. This is a photograph of the Warren Tavern. This tavern is the tavern that Knowlton bought and cut into pieces and repurposed around West Upton. And the Knowlton Hotel Pleasant replaced it in that location. We have down here two photographs of the box mill where they made the boxes for the hats. The mill kind of spanned the waterway there, and in the picture here is a wagon just piled high with boxes that are headed to the factory. And another photograph inside of the workers inside the factory. With all of the buildings and development and investment that the Knowltons put into West Upton in building their business, they couldn't dare do that without having a fire department. So the Knowltons had their own fire department, and it was consisted of a hook and ladder truck, or I shouldn't say truck, hook and ladder wagon, horse-drawn wagon, a hose wagon. This was a very beautiful chromed lantern that hung on the hook and ladder wagon. And this is a leather water bucket used for fighting fires. Also, we have here the original steam whistle from the factory. There's a 4-note whistle, and it was mounted at the top of the factory. And it was blown in the morning, I think at 5:30 in the morning, to get people up. So this was the whistle to get them up, get them to work, and to mark the end of the day. We would like to acknowledge the staff members that supported the development of this display. They put a lot of hours into it over many months, and it's turned out really to be very popular. In addition to Ellen, we had Larry Doucette and Bill Taylor doing research for us, and
I'm very grateful for the people that helped me with their support. Joan Burrell was a great help. Lainey Carroll not only helped set up the display, but she had so much knowledge about the time she worked in the hat industry.
And so we invite you to come by and see the display and look at the details.